Welcome to this new series of Tulika Conversations where we speak to authors about their book brought out by Tulika Books. Today we have with us Dr. Rahul Govind, who teaches history at Delhi University. We'll be speaking about his book, The King's Plunders, The King's Bodies, Prize Laws, the British Empire and the Modern Legal Order, which was published by Tulika in 2023. So, to start off, Dr. Govind, how did this book come together? I would like you to tell us more about your prior research and how it shaped this book. One can only do it in retrospect, but was there a particular moment in your research that you realized something like this needs to be written, or did it develop parallelly?
Thanks, Suyog. So, this book, it's titled The King's Plunder, The King's Bodies, and it's about prize laws, which I'll explain at a moment, prize laws and its relationship to empire. The way I got interested into this theme and this topic is actually while I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s, I came across this prize charter that was basically this charter that the king gave to the East India Company. But frankly, at that point, I didn't quite know how to make sense of it. The only thing I knew was that there was a certain way in which there was a certain legal code for violence and conquest, and I then related it to what I was researching at that point in time, and that was my PhD dissertation, which went on to become a book called The Infinite Double. And in that book was really about how economics as a science developed in the early 19th century, and the problem that I wish to investigate was the fact that the idea of an economic science is when a particular domain called the economy gets constituted, which is distinct from, or ostensibly distinct from, the political and the social, and a certain method is developed that is supposed to is directed towards this domain and is supposed to explain the economy. And I was struck by the fact that modern political economy, which is often traced to the early 19th century, in England often, someone like Ricardo is sometimes seen as foundational. What is the connection between the development of this science and this method and the fact of imperialism and the empire and the East India Company? And I found it very curious that at exactly the moment when the East India Company, through its imperialism and through empire, was making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between what we call the political and what we call the economic. After all, this was a corporation given rights and charters by the crown and also by parliament, and engaging in war and engaging in trade in ways that it makes very difficult to say that they're two separate domains. At that very moment in Britain, you have the development of something like economics. And so I was interested in diagnosing that, and my argument was that this essentially developed as a kind of decoy, almost as a way to not confront the questions of political violence. And the broader argument is that in some ways economics as a science has this kind of imperial birthmark where and the idea of having a method that can be directed towards a domain called the economy that is in fact abstracted from institutional, political, military, historical questions is something that I think is not simply a question of a misreading of what happened in the early 19th century, but is something that haunts economics as a discipline even today. So that was my earlier work. The work that the book, The King's Plunder and The King's Bodies, the present work that we're discussing, tries to do in some ways in parallel fashion to questions of jurisprudence and political theory, what this earlier work was doing in the context of economics.
So this brings me to the subtitle of the book. prize laws, the British Empire, and the modern legal order. So, could you please explain us what are these prize laws and what role they play in our understanding of Indian history?
All right. So it's true that in some ways prize laws are a very obscure theme or topic. But again, what struck me, going back to what I initially said, and this is something I learned only in the last few years. So I knew that there was this prize charter. What prize laws are essentially laws about the acquisition of property during war or hostilities. So there is almost what one could call a jurisprudence of plunder. That is to say that during war, there is a legal way in which you can acquire the property of the vanquished. And so there is a set of laws or systems that adjudicate on such a thing. Now these laws, and historically, someone like Hugo Grotius, who's known, again, ironically but very interestingly, as the founder of international law, actually wrote on prize law. In fact, his major work was on booty, where he was actually taking part in a case. But the interesting fact is that this domain of jurisprudence around the acquisition of property of the vanquished is something that Grotius, when he discusses this problem in the 17th century, and people were well aware of this, it goes back to Greco-Roman times. So there's a long history that people in Europe were aware of. Analogous forms of jurisprudence, although I have not investigated this, can also be found sort of in the history of Islam, in the history of the Dharmashastras. You see this, but these are issues I've not got into. But the point is that in England, which is what I'm focusing on, in England, if you look at it from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, what you see is that increasingly the king or the monarch is making a kind of a claim, and it is the monarch that gives what are called commissions that allow actors, whether they are traders or private actors, that gives them the authority to actually not just conduct war, but also acquire property over the vanquished. And then if these are seen as legitimate commissions, they are obviously seen as legitimate acquisitions. But these are often adjudicated in what are called the admiralty courts, which are considered king's courts. Now, what I found fascinating is the fact that this particular prize charter, which was given in 57 and 58 by the king, in England, this was actually something that was initially requested by the company. The company, which was undertaking wars in the subcontinent, made a request that they be given this authority for prize. If you look at the long history of the company, they actually had the powers of an admiralty court at points. They had martial law, so they had various kinds of what are obviously overtly political and military powers. But they make this particular request, and so the king gives a charter to the company that actually gives them the authority to acquire property in times of war. And what is interesting is that there are parliamentary laws around prize from the late 17th century. But what we see, and this speaks to the problem of how we understand the question of sovereignty in Britain also, that notwithstanding parliamentary statutes, clearly, as we see from this case, that the king also could independently and did independently give this. So, for instance, this charter of prize is not something that is validated by the parliament. This is simply a charter that is given by the king. And the East India Company, through this charter, is able to sort of acquire properties during wartime, not just in the 50s and 60s, but also subsequently throughout the early 19th century. So, part of my argument is that one cannot understand the nature of the East India Company and its expansion without understanding the fact that it has derived these very specific kinds of rights and authority from the king. And one of the things my book does is that there are several cases that are adjudicated that go all the way up in Britain, and we are talking about vast sums of money that East India Company armies actually acquire in the course of war. So my point is that this is not just a military issue, but also the fact of how we can understand the legality of the conquest of the East India Company and the fact that the East India Company in its actions cannot be understood without reference to king and king in parliament.
So, the ability of the king to grant this charter, as you said, is because of his sovereign power. So, how have you explored this concept of sovereignty in the book? How have you defined it?
So, again, this is a much contested and sort of debated terrain. So, because to understand precisely as your question asks, what is the nature of the authority of the king and how does he give this power? As you know, most scholarship generally tends to suggest, if you're looking at the history of Britain, that after the Glorious Revolution, so-called Glorious Revolution, actually in the 18th century, you have a decreasing importance of the king vis-a-vis parliament, right? At this point, I won't get into this kind of broader argument, but what I'm suggesting in my book is that if we are looking at whether the 17th, the 18th, or the 19th century in Britain, if we are looking at political identity, the key feature of political identity is allegiance. And you need to have allegiance to the king. So the king in Britain, in England, is a figure of sovereignty. And to understand that, the first part of my book is an analysis of this very famous case called Postnati in 1608, where I make the argument, which I think still holds well into the 19th century. And my argument is that one can't understand what the king and company are doing in the 18th century or the 19th century without understanding this particular figuration of sovereignty. And what is this figuration? Basically, this point was put forward in Postnati that we need to conceptualize sovereignty not in terms of a fixed territory or a fixed jurisdiction, but in terms of the king as both a natural person with heirs as well as someone who has what was called political capacities. So the basic problem that they were engaging with is that even if you might have distinct jurisdictional orders, so for instance you have England, you have Scotland, you have Ireland, you might have colonies in America, they are all distinct jurisdictional orders, but the fundamental fact of allegiance is towards the king and is something that is natural. So allegiance, which has to refer to the natural person of the king, is distinct from the different jurisdictional orders. And in that sense, that idea of allegiance, an allegiance towards the king, and you can see the correlate as that one of the definitions of treason is any encompassment of the death of the king or imagining the death of the king or queen and the heirs of the king and queen. So sovereignty is actually conceptualized not in terms of a static territory, not in terms of a people, not in terms of say the British people or the English people, but my argument is that it is conceptualized in terms of the king and the way in which the king has certain rights, including the rights of conquest, and that is how these distinct jurisdictional orders can multiply. So something like conquest, and this is I think a part of an important aspect to my argument, something like conquest is an entirely legal recognized activity that can only be understood in terms of the king's actions. So the broader argument is that we cannot understand sovereignty. So sometimes when historically we say the British Empire or the Spanish Empire or something like that, my point is something like British or Spanish don't have any actual legal meaning. The idea of political, we have to understand the idea of sovereignty in terms of specific legal institutions and protocols. And within Britain, the question of allegiance and allegiance to the natural person or to the person of the king is absolutely central. And so if we think of sovereignty not in terms of a static territory or a particular people confined to a particular territory, then we think of...
As it is understood at present.
No, but as it is, I think even understood in the past. I mean, the fact that we use terms, something like this, like say the British Empire, right? So the assumption is in a sense that, there is something like a British sovereign that moves out. So there is the British and then the British moving out, right? Whereas I'm trying to suggest that we can understand the expansion of the British Empire in terms of their own self-understanding, which is to say that there is the king and there are certain kinds of capacities and acts that he can undertake, and so he can conquer. So we have to think of politics as a dynamic entity, as literally as a living being. So alteration is part of, as it were, sovereignty. It's not like today where something like territorial integrity or conquest, at least technically, is, although now we know lots is happening, but is technically supposed to have been something not recognized. This was not a problem at all before the Second World War. So to understand, so to go back to the point, so if we think of sovereignty as a figure that alters and changes and expands like a living organism, then we can understand literally that the more specific technical point that I was making, that it's only through the king that we can understand this kind of expansion. So something like prize laws is a branch of his ability to conquer, because war and peace, notwithstanding the importance of parliament, again we should remember it is not just parliament but king in parliament, but the king is someone who is sort of in a sense solely concerned with questions of war and expansion, and so the question of conquest is very much part of that kind of logic. So then to understand the East India Company, to my mind, and therefore this particular branch of prize law, one has to understand this notion of sovereignty, a sovereignty that actually, as it were almost like, does expand as part of its logic. It's not that that they are actually distinct entities and one has an inherent value that moves over to another entity or expands. It's the fact of conquest is recognized as part of the rationale of sovereignty, and to understand that, one has to understand something like the figure of the king. I mean, that's broadly what I tried to suggest.
So my next question is more methodological, in the sense, as you said, that sovereignty is a dynamic concept, but broadly it's understood as this static thing. So as a historian, if one looks at the archives with this static definition of sovereignty in mind, what kind of problems does it create? How do we approach these concepts when dealing with the past?
Yeah, I think this, as you said, a kind of static form, can be seen in two distinct ways, which I think are, in a sense, mappable to one another. One is that we have a delimited territorialized notion, and that delimited territorialized notion is kind of mapped onto a name, like a people or a nation. So, say the British or the American or whichever term you wanted to look at. Whereas, so that has led to, for instance, many arguments, almost that has become part of a common sense, that something like, Britain was a nation state, or the fact that you had nationalism, Europe had already achieved not just nationalism but also a certain kind of democracy, and that you can map the progress of, say, something like Britain without accounting for empire, right? So even if empire is obviously, and a lot of studies actually assume that the East India Company is a distinct story and it does not have to be accounted for in a narrative about Britain. But my point is not just the ethical point about, how does one not take empire into account, but literally the way sovereignty was conceived was not with reference to some ready-made category of the people. As we know, even within the metropolis, franchise, was not universal. There were several kinds of distinctions on the basis of property sect in the 19th century. That's another story. But so my point is that if we take this into account, we realize that something like the more assumed idea of the polity as a nation of people that represents itself is something that really emerges as an institutional fact or as part of a world order only after the Second World War. So there's no question of of having any country, quote unquote, in the West as being sovereign or being a nation state, because the logic of the polity is what, as I'm trying to argue, has to be understood within this question of sovereignty, the relationship between sovereignty and parliament, which I've not got into. But in terms, and parliament does play a very important role also vis-a-vis the East India Company. But my point is that the king also plays an independent role. So something like these prize charters, for instance, is something that parliament does not intervene in. Although parliament is extremely important to understand, say, the revenue settlement. So several other sort of aspects of understanding the company, what they're doing in the 18th century or the early 19th century. So I think focusing on this, so to my mind, this gives us another way of looking at, the history of nationalism or the history of democracy and questions of this sort.
Okay, this brings me to my last question, which there are two aspects to it. One is academically, how do you locate the work as speaking to other disciplines? Because the book is very much looking at the issues of law and jurisprudence and political theory and philosophy. And the other related aspect of it is about uh, the historian's responsibility, which is time and again invoked at present, the kind of role they play. So, of course, historians can't uh, resolve problems, like that's not their role, but they do address the problems which exist at present and help us understand it in a particular way. So, the kind of arguments you have made and the concepts you've used in the book, what kind of issues can we understand better in a local or global context with the help of the book?
Yeah, so I was, the book of course does try to speak to the disciplines that you mentioned, and actually part of a very important aspect of the argument, which in some ways relates to my earlier work, is that a lot of what we take to be, say, the canon of political thought or Western political thought, if you look at people like Mill or others. Now, people have, of course, argued that they've ignored empire. But it's not just that they've ignored empire, but they have not accounted for the way in which European polities functioned and expanded, right? So, it's in some ways a conversation with this domain, but it is also a critique of this domain, because even though we say it's political theory, my argument is that is really the way in that political theory, even without us being aware of it, actually mediates our relationship with the past. So, for instance, standard distinctions like the distinction between state and society, these are categories that are being minted in political theory, and this is the lens through which we look at the 18th century or the 19th century. But my argument is that that is not how we can understand the phenomena of the 18th and 19th century. We can't understand it in terms of these categories of political theory. So, in a sense, related to my previous work, a lot of what we call political theory simply obfuscates this particular kind of history, right? And of course, the larger question is that even in the contemporary, whether the tools and the kind of categories of political theory help us actually understand political phenomena. Can you, for instance, I mean, that's where I think history is very important. Isn't the narratological element essential? That you can't model something like political theory or sociology in terms of some kind of logic. It has to be, something that has an aspect of logic and has an aspect of narrative and is rooted in certain archives and different kinds of archives. So that's one point about disciplines. And the second is, yes, I mean, I think at one level not completely surprising that many of the things I'm investigating has their resonance today. I mean, I try to address this briefly in the conclusion, where I make the argument, I have this argument about the king's ghosts or the king's specters, and many of the contemporary constitutional issues today. I mean, so for instance, the exact powers of the governor vis-a-vis the kind of elected assembly, questions of preventive detention. I mean, so what is, it's kind of, it doesn't it's not straightforward in the sense that what is discomforting is the fact that, so for instance, in the late 18th century, you had parliamentary acts giving immunity to East India Company officials against judicial review. Now that essentially is the framework for something like a preventive detention law. So these were laws then and these are laws now. Of course, at that point, these are laws made by bodies that are not at all representative. Obviously, these are completely unrepresentative and they are explicitly doing it for imperial interests. But what is interesting is that these ideas are also are being entrenched in orders that are democratic, right? So there is a uncomfortable kind of sensation that, that at this level, even though these are vastly different setups, you have similar kinds of arguments being used. And so what does that tell us about about so many about so many things that are happening today. So even if you look at the governor and the elected assembly, I mean, these are very similar to questions that were being debated around the relationship between king and parliament, for instance, or even something like AFSPA, the idea of having a legislation that guarantees immunity, so questions of martial law. So I think there are several, and I want to kind of emphasize here that my point is obviously not to say that yes, so this is all from the English past, and now we can kind of sort of from nothing, as it were, build a kind of indigenous sort of alternative epistemology or something. I obviously think that is simply not available. But one has to deal with the institutions that one has and try to find ways to make a more just order in one way or the other. So in that sense, I think, in response to your question, that a study of history really helps, precisely because it kind of unsettles, because any notion of the present involves a notion of the past. So when we are looking at history, it in that sense simultaneously unsettles both the past and the present. So we might be unsettled by the fact that there are actual legislations that allow for certain kinds of immunities, right? But and that is exactly the point that is being raised today, that these are legislations, these are legitimate in the sense that they are by democratic governments, but still they sort of raise a whole host of questions about questions of justice, questions of rights, that can be raised in a setting obviously that could not or would not have been raised in an imperial setting. So the connections between the past and the present are obviously much more fraught and messy if one undertakes a serious investigation of both the past and the present. And that's what I hoped that a work like this might contribute to a discussion of that sort.
Thank you, Dr. Govind.